they can't engage the science on it. Why do these ages in which you're talking about earlier, how the drop in ages from pre-flood to post-flood actually matches, and we've discussed this many times on the channel with many different creation scientists, this perfect biological decay curve.
Yeah.
Because
Dr.
Robert
Carter has done some work on this, I know, where he matches it to an exponential decay curve.
Right.
And it's like, did the ancient Hebrews know about exponential functions? I don't think so.
Were they experts in mathematics and biology and decay curves to
there's no way
this data?
This is real data. It matches an exponential decay curve, and so there's probably some kind of natural reason. Exponential decay curves are all over nature.
Right.
That's my background, is a hard science degree. You use exponential equations all the time.
Can you unpack that for maybe someone who isn't really familiar with what we're talking about, and how maybe genetic, from the biblical understanding of genetics, would explain that decay curve in the long ages? Is that something that we can give an account for scientifically?
Yeah. So Craig actually, this is one of the things he thinks is palpably false, is the long ages. And also the immortality that Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden. He says that's impossible. People can't live forever. And he says that the fruit in the garden is magical. So they ate it and they just magically live forever. And I responded to this in some depth, actually, because if you look at the science of aging, it's not difficult to understand scientifically how someone could live forever. What's difficult to understand is why we age at all. That's actually the problem. Like, scientifically, we don't actually have a real good explanation for aging. As far as we can tell, our cells are structured so they could just keep going forever, as long as they keep getting energy, right? And everything keeps, when you don't get bashed in the head or whatever, things should continue on forever. The best answer is likely that mutations accumulate over your lifespan. But even there, it's kind of a little weird, because we have two different kinds of cells in our body. We have somatic cells. Soma is the Greek word for body. And we have germline cells, which are stem cells. And somatic cells, it's called the Hayflick limit. If you culture human somatic cells in like a petri dish or something, they can only live to be about 60 days. And so the big question when they discovered this is, well, why do humans last much longer than that? If our cells can only last 60 days, why do humans last forever? Or not forever, but many years. And it turns out that stem cells can last much longer. And part of the reason is somatic cells, when DNA replicates or copies itself, there are these sections of DNA at the end of every chromosome called telomeres. And every time DNA copies itself, a tiny little bit of the telomere gets cut off. And eventually, when you get to too many copies, stuff starts getting cut off that is not the telomere. The telomere is there to protect the rest of the chromosome. But once the telomere gets completely removed, then important stuff starts getting cut off and the cell dies, right? That's the most likely reason for the Hayflick limit, why cells can only live so long. But it turns out in stem cells have a protein called telomerase that extends the telomere. So It just keeps extending the telomeres. And so I don't know how relevant this is, but so the question is, why couldn't you have telomerase active in somatic cells? There doesn't seem to be any reason why you couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. So that's one possible reason for aging, is maybe Adam and Eve were created so that telomerase would be active in somatic cells. It can't be the whole answer. They've actually tried this, right, to activate telomerase, and the result is cancer. You just get cancer when that happens. Well, what is cancer? Cancer is a result of cells that are growing out of control because the control mechanisms that prevent them from doing that are broken, right? And so what we think now is that mutations are probably in general the cause for aging. And so I don't think there's any reason in principle why we couldn't have things like, or why Adam and Eve couldn't have things like DNA repair mechanisms that we know we have these some of the time, but what if Adam and Eve had a whole bunch more of it so that all errors were corrected when they had mutations? As for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of, or the tree of life that they would eat so they could live forever. Craig makes the point, that's a good point, that even after Adam and Eve sinned in Genesis 3, God says that if they remain in the garden, they will eat from the tree of life and live forever. So sin does not cause physical death, right? God was saying that even though they've sinned, they can eat from the tree of life and still live forever. So I have to kick them out of the garden so that they'll die. So what was it about the supposedly magic fruit of the tree of life that kept them living forever? Well, I've speculated that a lot of these mechanisms, biochemical mechanisms that Adam and Eve might have had that are lost now, like extra DNA repair mechanisms, active telomerase in somatic cells. There's all kinds of other things that could have been going on. Some of them might have required what's called in biochemistry cofactors. And those are special molecules that are required for certain things in your cells to function right. And vitamins and minerals are cofactors. So the reason it's important to eat your vitamins is because they're cofactors and they help things work right in your body. And if you're missing certain kinds of vitamins, you will get diseases. So vitamin C is an essential vitamin because we cannot synthesize it. We have to eat it in our diet. And if one thing about pirates, right, is pirates are always portrayed with missing teeth. Well, why is that? It's because in the age of wooden ships and pirates, they didn't know they didn't know about vitamin C. And so if you went to sea without a source of vitamin C and you didn't have vitamin C enough, you would get a disease called scurvy. And one of the symptoms of scurvy is you start losing your teeth. And so regular navies started to require that their ships bring along barrels of apples and make their sailors eat it during the voyage so they get vitamin C. But pirates didn't do that. So you've got, again, so that's an example of if you don't eat the right stuff, specifically a fruit with vitamin C in it, you're going to get a disease and start degenerating. Okay, so my speculation is that the tree of life had a fruit that had very specific concoction of molecules in it that were like essential vitamins and minerals for human beings to live forever. And once God kicked them out of the garden, they didn't have access to it anymore. So they started degenerating.
I think those are some excellent answers. That's really good. Like what you were saying about the telomerase, that you've got active telomerase if you were to have it in somatic cells, which telomerase, from my understanding, prevents senescence, which is cell death, adds new DNA to the cell, prevents the telomeres from shortening, is what you're, because shortening telomeres over time results in aging and death, from my understanding. So yeah, if you were to have, and these are all scientific reasons, it makes sense with mutation accumulation, degeneration, wild changes after the flood, that your pre-flood humans, or of course before the fall, you'd have these mechanisms in place, including the DNA repair enzymes that you mentioned, Ben.
Yeah, and because there's so much information in biology, it would be almost impossible to recreate this stuff because it'd be just too hard to find because these sequences are so rare. Like, but one thing about the flood also that creationists have worked on is the population bottleneck reduces genetic diversity. So we talked about that in reference to inbreeding before. So if you lose a lot of genetic diversity, it's very plausible that lifespans would decrease dramatically. And so when it was just Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, and they're the only ones who survived the flood, that's a population bottleneck. And Robert Carter has calculated that they would have lost probably about 20% of their genetic diversity in that population bottleneck. And that certainly, almost certainly contributed to the decline in lifespans after the flood.
Well, that's a lot of genes that we wouldn't, I'll say this, Sam, and then go ahead. That's a lot of genes that we would have had in the pre-flood world because of that genetic bottleneck. And so, I mean, if Adam would have had 20 million variants, the flood reduces that in half, let's say 10 million, and a lot of diversity just in general lost. From my understanding today, people using CRISPR or those that are into longevity, we've got a video, and I can't remember all the details of it. Our ministry partner, someone who helps out here, Matt, did it. He's done a lot of study on biblical longevity, where those that are not even creationists or Christians have admitted or recognized that there's certain genes, longevity genes, that you could turn back on, hypothetically, that would result in people living to 1,000. I mean, these are people that don't have any investment in Christian theology, but even they're recognizing that there's certain genes that are broken that if turned back on or fixed, we could live a lot longer than we do today, which I think is amazing.
I think in general, that's probably the case. I suspect most of those genes have probably been deleted by now, because generally if genes are not being used, eventually there'll be a deletion mutation, and because they're not contributing anything, that will just carry on, right? So usually when genes don't get used, they get deleted by deletion mutations.
Good point.
I kind of think that God is preventing us from living longer, but I have kind of maybe theological reasons for believing that, but we could be able to increase human lifespan a little bit. But most scientists I've talked about with this are very skeptical of living longer. Like,
I don't think they'll ever be able to do it.
Right? But people like Jordan Peterson are into this stuff. It's why he likes lobsters, because lobsters don't die natural deaths. And I think actually lobsters do have telomerase active in all their somatic cells. The only reason lobsters die is because they outgrow their shells and they basically get constricted.
Yeah.
So I think this is the basis of Peterson's fascination with lobsters. And he promotes stuff like taking infusions of NADH, which is a common cofactor, like what I was talking about earlier, in the body, and stuff like that. There are things you can do to increase your health for sure. So I'm not doing that, but
I think there's a certain, and again, don't quote me on this because we did a study on it and put out some videos a year or two ago, but I think there's a certain enzyme that's found in all cells, superoxide dismutase, I think it's called. Matt has spoken on that. And some of these creatures like lobsters actually have a high amount of it, which helps them to live a lot longer, like you're saying. And so there's certain enzymes that we've probably lost in terms of the amount that we have over time since creation and the flood, that going back closer to creation, since we've lost so much, we'd have much more of that to sustain our function and health and longevity. So, I mean, just so many great points on that topic, Ben.
Yeah, I think superoxide dismutase, if I'm not mistaken, gets rid of oxygen radicals, which are damaging to your cells. Don't quote me on that. I don't have my biochemistry books in front of me, but that's what it sounds like. Oxygen radicals are damaging to cells, and that sounds like it would be an enzyme that takes care of oxygen radicals or something.
Yeah, so if you have some of these creatures like lobsters that have much more of this than we do as humans, then a lot of those free radicals, harmful things building up in systems, you have a lot of those enzymes to get rid of it and sustain longevity. So
one interesting thing from biochemistry is we can synthesize vitamin D, and we do it when sunlight hits our skin.
Right.
So there's a certain wavelength of UV light from the sun that our body takes advantage of the energy of it and uses it to make vitamin D. Well, it turns out that this wavelength of UV light also causes DNA mutations of a very specific kind. And our body also has a DNA repair mechanism for those specific kinds of mutations.
Wow.
So I think this is evidence that God designed us this way, that yes, we're going to get this UV light that we can make vitamin D with, but it's going to cause mutations. But we have the fix for that, right? And I think part of the degeneration and reduced lifespans is probably we just started losing some of these mechanisms that God originally designed for us that prevent those kinds of degeneration effects, like prevents mutations or fixes mutations. We just don't have all those anymore.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, I think those are some great points.